Hi, YouTube. Some technical difficulties, but I am with you now. I think, on time, just barely. I like to be a little early, so it was good that I was trying to be a bit early to address some issues. And yeah, so today is my second live, and last week I announced my membership. So we're building out the back end, but we do have things that are ready, and it's in the description of this live. So definitely check it out after the live. But what we're going to be touching on today is compliance manuals. Now, this series of lives, and I'm going to continue doing lives even though I'll have a closed membership. I'm recognizing that people would want to have access to the information, and not everyone is in a situation to jump into a membership that is being launched now. It is, I think, useful to have some of these discussions. And as a financial services regulator, one of the things that I have experienced in my career is the fact that compliance professionals have a lot of questions. And at times you will ask the regulator, and sometimes the regulator cannot tell you what to do, or at some points in time, you might find that there's not sufficient regulatory clarity. So what I'll do in some of the lives, and I'm hoping that you'll join me on these lives, is go over some of the things that I've seen in relation to different compliance topics to kind of help with understanding. And the live chat is enabled, so you can ask questions. I have my little notes here in terms of what this is. I'll be here on the lives, and I'm aiming for like 45 minutes to an hour. So I think it is something useful. It's a different platform, and I think that you're seeing people reaching out more and having a lot more questions. If I could just step back as well, financial services has been my area of expertise for a number of years in different sectors. I've worked in different sectors. But fintechs, people in the fintech space also have a lot of questions when they are finding that they are overlapping with financial services regulators. So cryptocurrency exchanges, they need compliance manuals too. Virtual asset service providers, I did a video recently in relation to the FATF travel rule, and they're required to have AML CFT procedures. Guess what? That would be in a compliance manual. And regulators do review compliance manuals. You have to update them because it's a living document. But there are a number of issues that I've seen over the years, and I'm going to get into those issues. So in no particular order. Again, I think it's important for me to give a disclaimer. So I am an active employed regulator, but the views on the channel definitely are all my own. They do not reflect the views of any regulatory authority or international standard setter. And at times I may refer to an international standard setter, and in the case of AML CFT, that will be the Financial Action Task Force. So just know I'm not representing them. I'm also not a lawyer, so this is not legal advice, and I just want to make sure that I put that out there as well. So without much delay, let us look at the membership first, and then we get into the topic for the live today. So the membership, chasing compliance. There's another video on that. Like I said, we've been building out the back end. I'm pretty excited about it. I do believe that it will bring some real value to persons wanting to have a frank discussion in relation to the compliance issues that they are seeing on the ground. And you might not have the resources at your disposal. You might not be able to ask your regulator a direct question. And not because that the regulator is not willing to help, but you might have a bit of fear of entrapment or the information you say being used against you. And I get it. I definitely get it. So again, it's in the description below. I do hope you join me. We're going to have it open for people to sign up and jump in. It's not free, but it's not expensive either, to jump in and join me at Ignus Solutions, which is my company. So Yes. So once I get that out of the way, we can dive into the content today. So one of the things that I definitely want to touch on with compliance officers is that we get it as a regulator. It's a demanding job. It definitely is. I have the utmost respect for those that try. But one of the sad commentaries is that compliance people tend to be in silos by themselves. People within the firm think that compliance is something that they would need to do for themselves, and it's not something that, okay, I get it, I get the training, I know what I'm supposed to do, and we don't get it. So compliance manuals tend to be something that's solely within the wheelhouse of a compliance officer, sometimes to address their minds to. And one of the areas that I've seen is the compliance manuals where you have a lot of omissions and errors. You send it into your regulator to be reviewed. The regulator looks at it, and what happens? The regulator will then come back and give you some guidance. And a lot of regulators issue guidance in relation to what should and should not be in your compliance manual. But one of the first errors that I see, it's an easy spot. You can go to, I start at the table of contents and I look for whether you have left out legislation or you're using repealed or outdated legislation. That is one of the first errors that I tend to pick up when I'm reviewing compliance manuals. It is something that I think is sometimes difficult when you have a lot of amendments, but it's an easy spot. And in my career, what I've seen is that there's some usual suspects in relation to repealed legislation. So when I'm looking for what are the applicable statutes, it's almost cookie cutter for a regulator who's been in the position for a little while to pick up on what those pieces of legislation you've either missed or that you've included that are no longer applicable. So that is definitely one of the areas that I've seen common errors and omissions. And it's not that hard to address your minds to it. I think you maybe need a separate document that tells you what is the applicable legislation and keep your ear to the ground in relation to what legislative reforms are happening. The second error or omission that I've seen is in relation to complaints handling and advertising. Now, this might not seem like something that is, appropriate for the compliance manual, but I can tell you it definitely is. And, first I would want to look at the complaints handling. This is not just for firms to figure out what customers are unhappy with or clients are unhappy with for the purposes of customer retention and maybe charging them more money. That is not what I'm talking about. Your complaints procedures need to set out who should be dealing with what, how you are going to escalate certain serious complaints, in what time frame, what happens if you can't get it redressed, where does it go? Do you need to lock something else? Do you need to make a report in relation to it to another entity? In some jurisdictions, you have ombudsmans. So a client that's aggrieved can complain to an external party. And again, there may be liability to the firm if you don't handle a complaint properly. And I can recall UK, I think it was an insurance firm years ago, had some similar issues. And when the then regulator, was the then FSA, realized what was going on, the penalties were really stiff and they had to go through a whole remediation exercise that had they had a better complaints handling procedure, they would have saved themselves a lot of pain and money. Now, complaints are and can be a canary in the coal mine. Now, I might be dating myself with that particular analogy. And if you are not familiar with the purpose of a canary in a coal mine, what would happen decades, maybe a century ago, I don't know. If you were a miner toxic gases could build up from mining coal, and it still can happen. And what you would do is send down a canary, you would release a canary, and if the canary dies, you know that the oxygen levels are falling or toxic gases levels are rising. And so complaints could act in a similar manner. Do you have a toxic situation that is developing, say, with a particular account? Are complaints coming from a particular account manager, or client relationship manager, or are they coming from clients that are from a particular jurisdiction or in a particular business? In a sense, the complaints can help you create a heat map of what could be an emerging threat or risk or other issue that can transcend compliance, but definitely can impact the operational risk of a firm. So it's one of the areas that I see as not being given enough treatment if it is included. And if it's not included, even worse, you don't have any procedures and you're just, risking it right on the face of it, which is definitely not the position you would want to be in. Now, I mentioned complaints in advertising, and I put them together because they kind of lend themselves well to market conduct provisions. But even where you don't have a lot of robust market conduct provisions in a jurisdiction, they tend to fall under that category. And as it relates to advertising, regulators are very focused on making sure that they have principles in place for persons to not missell. So you have a policy in terms of advertising. You want to make sure that it is above board. So regulators are now more focused on making sure things are fair, clear, and transparent, and that customers can make an informed decision or are aware of what is in a service or product that they may be getting from your institution. Regulators are also very minded to not have the gotcha clauses embedded in your services. So where we see sometimes, again, no complaints come up, it could be that there was a failure in the advertising issue. And mis-selling is actually a regulatory risk in a number of jurisdictions. So if you sell something to a client and you did not explain fully what was involved, you probably will end up in a dispute that goes into the complaints bucket. But in reviewing the case, if it's found that the firm was really not fair in relation to how they advertised, or they hid information, or there was something wasn't above board, what would then happen is that, guess what? They're going to find in favor of the client 9 times out of 10, or maybe 10 times out of 10, because there was a duty of care by the licensee to be a bit more cautious and circumspect in relation to their advertising function. And I think it is, again, one of those areas that is going to become more heavily scrutinized by regulators going forward. You already have different elements of disclosures being monitored or regulated or subject to guidance on what licensees can and cannot see. And that's definitely the case in the insurance industry, as well as certain parts of the investment business sector. So with mutual funds, you want to know whether, what you're investing in, whether you have a right for redemption, what are the terms, what interest, what's the performance of this fund, and where you can get more information, who's the auditor. There's a lot of information that you can get. But for other financial services and products, regulators are even getting to the point of being a bit more, some would say pedantic, but sometimes I think it's necessary because some firms like to toe the line, and regulators may be even telling you what size font to use in your emails or your written documents, and put things up front and clear so that people understand. And the analogy is that you see it in other industries with tobacco products. They have to put certain warnings in huge fonts, and I mean, the font of the warning is usually bigger than the font of the labeling of that particular product. So you have that. But it's also important in terms of advertising for there not to be data dump. because there are other forms that might feel like, okay, regulator, you want us to have all of this information to the client, we'll give them all the information. And then you just vomit out all of this information into forms that overwhelm the client, overwhelm a potential client, and they still can't make an informed decision. So that doesn't help the situation as well. And again, regulators might be getting a little more involved in how advertising is carried out to make sure that things are better addressed. I think that is definitely the direction it's going in. Now, there are some other things that I've seen, and there's one particular area of the compliance manual that is a vexing issue for me, and that is in relation to your risk assessment, how it's applied, and due diligence collected. Now, let me explain. This one might be a little controversial. Risk assessments. You're supposed to risk assess your clients, whether they're high risk, low risk, and some would have medium risk. I'm not a fan of fence sitting, but I'll shortly have a blog out in relation to what I feel about risk assessments and risk assessment frameworks and the tiers of the risk assessments and how it can be better done to serve you. But with that said, I have a real issue with compliance manuals and compliance practices where people apply a risk assessment framework and set out in their manual, right, we're going to collect all these documents, and when it comes time to differentiate between risks, you can't collect anything else. So let's take a step backwards. The low risk scenario. A lot of manuals do not use the opportunity to actually have simplified due diligence procedures as it relates to a low risk customer. And let's take an example. I was talking about a case in the UK. Let's just use a hypothetical case in the United Kingdom. For example, you have a 92-year-old pensioner. He has had a bank account with your bank for over 3 decades. You are updating due diligence, and you request from this pensioner updated identification documents. The only thing that's hitting his account are his pension payments from the government. That's it. And he's living either in the house, he or she is living in the house they own, or assisted living, or with family. You have all this information on file. But you ask him for updated identification documents. You have his passport ID on file. It's expired. Now, with the current global circumstances aside, you're going to say, well, what about a driver's license? If he's in assisted living or have other health challenges, it may be that he was not permitted to have a driver's license for the last 12, 15 years or whatever period of time. So there's no updated driver's license. In the United Kingdom, certain social services do not provide picture identification. They might have a number or a code, and that doesn't help you with the identification. You are then saying, well, you'll have to close his account because you cannot complete your updating of due diligence. And to my mind, as a regulator, remember these are my personal views, that is wrong. If you are applying simplified due diligence, what is the purpose of getting an updated passport copy? What's the purpose of him renewing his passport simply to provide it to a bank? He's not changed his identification. His transaction patterns have not changed. He's not had any other issue that would raise suspicion with the bank for a period of 5, 10 years. And I think that when it comes to the procedures that are created for due diligence purposes, I think a lot of institutions they're challenging themselves and they're frustrating their customers. They're creating a lot of friction in the process where they shouldn't be. And so this is, I might sound a little bit passionate, but these are real scenarios that are happening to real people. And if your compliance manual doesn't make a provision for simplified due diligence, that's a missed opportunity. because you are supposed to be looking at putting your resources, your limited resources, to the areas that present the greatest risk. And is the pensioner collecting £400 or £200 a month? I don't know what the pension amount payment is in the UK, but is a pensioner collecting a few £100 per month that goes into your banking institution at risk for money laundering, terrorist financing, or some other financial crime? It's not being embezzled. It's coming from another competent authority. So HM Treasury and the National Services are involved in cutting that check. And at the same token, here are the issues that are being presented to just maintain a bank account. And beyond the practicality of it, and there are a lot of people looking at financial inclusion issues, low risk customers should have facility within your compliance manual for simplified due diligence. And I think that that's a omission that is happening far too often. If you are a compliance professional, I would implore you to actually revisit that and see what can be done in relation to updating your manual. Now, I will give this caveat: not every business can use simplified due diligence. I think it is appropriate in some cases, and in some industries, it is not. And if you have a question, I'm glancing every now and then at the laptop to check to see whether anyone is dropping any comments in the chat. Just feel free to drop some comments in the chat. But I think it's important to get that bit out of the way. The next side of the fence is the high risk. So you have due diligence procedures in relation to your customers. But you ask for so much information for the average citizen that when you have to apply high risk, say a politically exposed person, they're always high risk, doesn't matter domestic or foreign, you don't know what to collect, or you don't have anything else to collect. Now, again, one of the things that I've seen in relation to the procedures that are set out in a compliance manual are things like, well, we need to get a notarized copy of his identification documents, his passport and his driver's license, or her passport and her driver's license. Why? And the reason I'm asking why, if you have a politically exposed person, any search engine, Google, Firefox, whatever you use, you will be able to get so much information in relation to that politically exposed person. And I'm sure you'll be able to get their identity, date of birth, where they live. So the utility bill question goes out the window, when they were elected, what posts they hold, what were their past lives, jobs, wives, husbands, children. You get all of that information from a free search service, much less the compliance checks that a lot of financial services firms use. So when you need to now apply enhanced due diligence, what do? And that is a differentiation that I see as an omission as well from compliance manuals. Again, it's a missed opportunity. And there's a need for compliance manuals, in my view, to be more dynamic and reflect on what the real circumstances are on the planet. Now, let's just call some names of people who are well known internationally: a Jeff Bezos, a Bill Gates, Elon Musk, any of them. You have them as a client. What due diligence information do you need from them as a high-risk individual? And you're rating them as high risk based on what's in your manual, their wealth, their influence, there are certain markers and indicators that, and certain characteristics that led to a higher risk. What are you going to ask them for? Are you going to ask them for a utility bill? Are you going to ask them to verify that utility bill? I don't understand, from my vantage point, where in financial services you have persons who are very wealthy, and I am guessing, I'm not 100% sure, that they might not have these issues, So again, calling some other names, a Richard Branson, a Tony Blair, we might not be talking about actual circumstances. And I'm curious if anyone has any views or might know, not revealing any confidential information on any of your clients, but What are the differentiated approaches that you use for the ultra high net worth individuals and the politically exposed persons that really provide you with meaningful due diligence? And let's go back to the politically exposed persons. What is the risk of money laundering or terrorist financing that you're looking at? If you go back and take a step back, you're supposed to be looking at geographical risk in all cases. Is there a heightened risk of corruption in particular regions of the world? And if it is that he or she could be siphoning monies from the public purse, what due diligence do you need to address your mind that your firm is not being used to facilitate corruption, embezzlement, siphoning of monies from public purse? What controls do you have in place? It could be that you're looking for something a little more nuanced. To my mind, it would be better to be nuanced, to have something that goes beyond a declaration, because that's also, I don't understand why you would need a declaration for a high net worth individual. You need something with more substance, something like that has legal weight. And with all that being said, it's important to recognize that, guess what? Criminals lie. And when people want to hide money, your systems have to be designed to detect that. So I'm being very careful in terms of what can be applied in the nuanced situation for high-risk customers. That's something that definitely will be fleshed out in the membership. But for the purposes of the live, this is to provoke some discussion and some thought. Even though, I'm not seeing any comments in the live chat, you can definitely drop me a comment afterwards. I do check all of the comments that are posted, and let me know what your views are in relation to this. So I've touched on that for the risk assessment for low risk, high risk, and my vexation in relation to the use of the term medium risk, because it's just fence sitting. It gives you no real insight as to which way your client is risk leaning. You don't know whether a client is just at the threshold of high risk or low risk. And so you just lump them there, and you could have potential powder kegs in your medium risk clients that you're unaware of. But in terms of differentiating that and having better analytics, definitely check out, there's a link to my blog in the description. Check out my blog. I try to post weekly, and I definitely will have some views in relation to that. But that is also another issue that we'll delve into more deeply, maybe some resources in the membership in the coming weeks. So definitely encouraging everyone to jump into the membership. Now, what else is there to talk about in relation to risk? When you're looking at your risk frameworks in your compliance manuals, I think it is important for not just the compliance officer to understand it, but for the staff that is actually going out with the spear and hunting for the clients to understand what the firm's risk tolerances are. And this is something that pops up when regulators carry out inspections. The compliance officer can do the best training in the world, but if it is that staff have not embraced the training, and this is not to say that the training wasn't tested, you can have people who do the training, are tested, pass with flying colors, and then take the position, I'll just go out and do what I want, or I'll just go out and do what I am accustomed of doing to make sure that the firm gets their clients. And that is a lot of the problems in relation to applied due diligence. A lot of persons think that it is for compliance officers to do alone. Compliance officers are typically just one person in the firm. Compliance is a firm-wide initiative. And so if you don't have the compliance built into the framework and the reward mechanisms, things can go off the rails quite quickly. Hi, good evening, Colleen. So one of the other elements that I think is important for risk assessment frameworks in terms of testing them and in terms of understanding the risk tolerances is to make sure that people understand them. And that's another thing that I've seen as maybe not an error or omission, but an aside to compliance manuals that could pose difficulties. We receive a document, it looks great. It looks absolutely great. But when you engage with the staff, review the files, go through the process, or there may be some other regulatory engagements that we would have in relation to a particular form, we realize that that's just really nice words. Those are nice words that mean nothing in practice. So that's another area that, if you're a compliance professional, please be mindful of. So let me take a sip of water. People are letting me off easy. I am not seeing any questions, no comments. So just a sip of water. Right. So the next thing that I've seen that is not properly addressed in the compliance manual is in relation to the money laundering reporting officer. And the duties are not often very well articulated in relation to what should happen. Now, when I say that, it's not to say that the manual doesn't address the mind to how suspicious transaction reports and how suspicious activities reports are reported. That is not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that it tends to be a bit anemic when you talk about not tipping off and not telling third parties, or how are you supposed to engage with your local financial investigation unit to avoid any situation of tipping off the client. So if you're processing transactions like a bank, you're supposed to engage with the local financial investigation unit and get permission to carry out a transaction or any series of transactions before you do it, and have, so the procedures in some cases are lacking in that particular area. That's one omission I have seen in a number of manuals. It will say who the MLRO is. It will have in relation to how to file, the MLRO filing suspicious activity reports and suspicious transaction reports to the reporting authority. It will even have in a general statement about tipping off, but it doesn't really go into adequate detail in terms of not tipping off to other staff, not tipping off to the client, what to do if you have a tipping off situation. That's also an omission that I've seen in some cases, and it is, I think, an easy fix. It's generally an easy fix. I did a video a few weeks back about my views in relation to compliance officers and money laundering officers on my channel. And I do have, maybe some might see it as controversial views in relation to people doing both. And so if you're curious about that, definitely check it out. In relation to suspicions, one of the other things that some firms are good at, some do omit. When a suspicion is raised, of course, the procedures will happen and the MLRO investigates and comes to a determination and all of that. But it doesn't go into depth in terms of the investigative process. Is it that you go to the employee who reported it and said, what made you suspicious? It didn't feel right, you document that, and then you do nothing else after that? Or do you really delve into it to get an idea as to what was the core of the suspicion, and document, say, the transaction, the date, the issues, the calls, file notes? How deeply do you go into the investigation? And what is in your manual that addresses its mind to the depth of the investigation that the MLRO is supposed to conduct? Now, yes, that might not be in a compliance manual. It could be in a separate policy document that the board produces, so that staff, if you have an employee issue where an employee might be helping out with bad behavior with a client or some other crime, you might not want that in the fullness of a compliance manual, but it would still be something that would show up in filings to the regulator, and it tends to be a bit anemic, as I've said. So there is that. What other matters have I seen in relation to compliance manuals? Oh, sanctions. Sanctions handling. So international sanctions get a lot of coverage. And I know in the United States, every financial institution has a very strong sanctions policy, or they're required to. OFAC is an ever-present anvil over the head of a lot of service providers. But in other countries, not so much at times. They're aware of sanctioning bodies. They're aware that they should have regard for sanctions. They're aware that they should not engage with sanctioned persons. But beyond actually getting into the fact that you should not engage with certain sanctioned persons, there are sanctioned persons that you can carry out transactions for, provided that you understand that the type of sanction and what is required to actually engage with that client. I also had a separate video in relation to sanctions, but when it comes to the compliance manual, that is another area that sometimes lots of words talking about the UN Securities Council and key resolutions, 1272, 1373, key resolutions that are posted in your manual. You might speak about the US, Canadian, EU, sanction, all these countries and grouping, geographical grouping, issuing sanctions. You might even set out specific countries that are deemed too high risk for your firm, that are subject to a number of sanctions. And all of that is well and good. But is it that you truly understand what is supposed to happen in relation to sanction screening for your clients? Do you understand what is supposed to happen to a client who may become a sanctioned person, and the different types of sanctions that may permit you to engage with certain clients based on what the terminal, the framing of that sanction is? So that's another element that I think is important for persons to consider. What else have I seen in relation to compliance manuals? One of the other things that comes up, and this is, I think, an aside, outside of the manual, one of the things that I've seen, it becomes evident, especially during the inspection process, that the compliance officer, and this is not somebody who's brand new and came into the firm yesterday, but that the compliance officer had nothing to do with the compliance manual and may not even be aware of what's in it. And I think that that is a huge cardinal sin. That is massive. Now, there are a number of factors at play, and some of the factors might include group compliance, drafting and providing it. And when group compliance drafts manuals for a number of jurisdictions, you tend to see more errors and omissions. The compliance officer being hired to be a figurehead, if we see that they're just, holding keeping a seat warm, and somebody else is behind the scene working on certain things in compliance, that is also an issue of concern. But again, it's one of the things that I think is important for compliance officers to make sure that they are aware of the full compliance manual. And that's another thing. There have also been stories in the regulatory community about compliance professionals finding out about certain factors of the business during an on-site inspection that are relevant to their job. That is a no-no. That's big. That is a big red flag for the regulator. And it's, we try to make sure that we keep a very stoic look to, or, when we realize something is wrong, document, and then we go from there. Some of the more comical errors that I've seen, one comical error I'll touch on. One of the comical errors that I've seen in relation to compliance manuals as well is that the compliance manual wasn't even your forms. There are again, chatter around the regulatory community for years gone by that somebody comes up with a great compliance manual and people basically just lift it and replace the name on the cover, but then don't replace the name or the referencing within the text. So they might do a fine replace for Simone and change it to Martin, but then when you're looking in the manual, you're seeing SM throughout when your initials are something else completely. And that's a dead giveaway for a regulator that, this is something that you've not really exercised your mind to. And when you have done that, you also have the error of having business in there that might not relate to what you're licensed to do. So you might have a licensee that's licensed to provide everything under the sun, the burgers, the fries, the chicken, everything. And you are only authorized to provide chicken nuggets. Now, I'm giving an analogy that is food-based and not financial services-based because I don't want to identify any particular industry sector. But it is one of the things that regulators see in relation to manuals, that you have things in your manual that you are not licensed to address your mind to. And in those cases, what the regulator will likely say is basically to overhaul the entire thing. Because if you see something like that, if you are in a regulator's position and you see a manual that belongs to someone else being presented as their own, okay, plagiarism aside, the industry will help out each other, and that's fine. Nobody's saying that you can't borrow from the best in class, but take the time to actually go through the document to make sure that you don't have such a glaring error in your document. It is one of the most glaring errors. So I think it's something simple now that you can check with technology, because you could do find replace, but even beyond the find replace, that doesn't fix all of the things, especially when there are unique abbreviations embedded in the document that you may miss. And another tip, if I am suspicious, this is me personally, if I am suspicious that a manual has been copied from another form, what I will do is look for certain key indicators that it's copied. You might do a really good job in relation to find and replace and getting out specific jargon, or even to the business type. So you've taken out the burgers and fries and put in nuggets because that's what you're authorized to provide. But there are certain things that I will do. And this is my trick that I do, as I've done it as a regulator, to see whether something has been copied. What I do is that I check two areas. Well, no, I check more than two areas, but I'm willing to tell you the tricks in two areas. I check your footnotes, because a lot of people will miss footnotes, or so they miss editing footnotes, and the footnotes might creep over without people checking the font is fine. People think that regulators won't read it. So we check footnotes and headers. And my second trick in relation to seeing whether a compliance manual or some other document has been copied from one form to another, I do word matches. And if I see a lot of similarities, on the face of it could mean nothing, but I look for specific sections where it should have some of the flavor of the compliance officer or that board. And when you look at other corporate material produced by that particular firm, it doesn't match up. So it's clear that they want the author. And it's important, I think, to make sure that even if you're using something as a reference, and people do it, we are aware of it, it's not something that's illegal. I think it would be incredibly important for you to check and make sure that, okay, you've gotten an assist in relation to this particular document that you're required to have. Actually take some time and go through it and make sure it makes sense and make it your own. I think those would be some of the key takeaways from my experience with compliance manuals. And red flags also pop up in the updating of the compliance manual. There are a lot of persons that would update a compliance manual and they would want to make sure that they go through and they scrub everything, but they don't provide a date of updating or they don't keep track changes. And some people are like, well, I don't want somebody else using my work, or I'm the compliance officer now, and I want to kind of, keep some of that magic behind the curtain. Not important, because the regulator can ask you when you've updated a manual and you send it to the regulator. Sometimes we do want track changes, and I think forms sometimes play games. I had an early video about the games that licensees can play with a regulator that we really don't like, and it seems like sometimes forms are being petty because the technology exists. It's easy. Firms are like, well, the regulator is looking for work to do. Let me just send them this document, nicely done without track changes. What track changes will do is help the regulator to respond to you faster and move on to the next. When you don't provide that regulator with the track changes, yeah, we can assess it. We can compare the past version to the current version and see what's different. And it can be line by line. But guess what? Your regulator is spending a lot more time in relation to your firm and assessing your firm. And the probability of seeing more, because now you have to spend more time with this licensee. And hey, while I'm spending time with this licensee, let me look over here at this other element of their, compliance and see what's going on. So it doesn't help a firm when a regulator has to spend more time in relation to anything in relation to your compliance. So if a regulator asks you for a document that you've updated, do yourself a favor and send the track changes copy. You're doing yourself a favor. It's not you're doing the regulator a favor. You're actually doing yourself a favor. And I think it's important to get that out. What else is there in relation to compliance manuals? Corporate governance. So while I'm targeting mainly compliance professionals, and these are the people who I am looking forward to engaging in discussions with, I'm also embracing directors. So the corporate governance element is critically important for you to get compliance manuals right. The firm, well, any regulated entity, the responsibility of the compliance function rests with the board, and often the board seems to forget that. The board of directors, or depending on how you're constituted, it might be a different grouping or a name, but you're responsible for the compliance function. You delegate it to the compliance officer. And in a lot of cases, boards used to, I think it's improved a lot in recent years, but boards used to just delegate and don't look back. And when it comes back for the board to approve a document, to endorse a document, it may have been more of a rubber stamp exercise than a holistic interrogation of what was done and getting a deeper understanding of the changes. Now, that is something that I think is changing for the better. Boards recognize that there's more at stake, and so they're giving more scrutiny to compliance documents. But more importantly, and I know I spoke about this in a conference, I'm not sure if I have a video in relation. Yeah, I think I might have a video in relation to, yes, senior managers. Regulators are focusing more on the people element. And why is that? When regulators take enforcement action and apply a penalty to a firm, it hurts the shareholders. Directors go off scot-free with their big bonuses and move on with their lives, and maybe go to another financial firm to misbehave, if they're the misbehaving type. But what regulators are focusing on now in relation to corporate governance and making sure that directors are actually doing what they're supposed to do, like running the firm, providing oversight, direction, taking decisions, and engaging meaningfully on compliance. When there are compliance failures, regulators are now becoming more aligned across the planet in terms of taking enforcement action in relation to people, in relation to the leadership. So in terms of errors and omissions, if you are a director of a financial services entity that is regulated and you are not fully on board with the compliance process, even if you're a non-exec director, actually it's more important that you are, make sure you amend that, and we're almost at the end of a year. Take that forward as something to change because it's very important, especially for the compliance manual, that you're engaged and you understand what risks your firm is maybe taking on. And so, guys, that is where I'm going to end in relation to the discussion on compliance manuals, but I'm going to just have a shameless plug in relation now to the membership. I spoke about it at the beginning of this live, and I'm going to speak a bit about it at present. And in the last video, I spoke about that was the pre-launch. As of 7 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time, the back end has been built out, and so there's a link in the description below for compliance professionals to jump in. They are going to be a limited number of slots, and it's already been restricted by a certain number. I want to think that quality is important, because what I want to do is actually be in that forum, and there are going to be topics every month. Some topics may run into a second month. There's going to be a discussion platform, but there's also going to be resources that are provided. There are going to be private calls. So a forum for compliance professionals that's not on YouTube. But for the YouTube element, as I was saying at the start of the live, I recognize that there might be some persons who either can't get into the membership because it's fully subscribed, or can't afford it, or the time zone, or there might be different issues. So I'm committed to doing at least 1 to 2 lives per month on a topical compliance issue. And if you think this is something that would be of interest to any of your colleagues who are compliance professionals or just compliance curious, because the content that I am aiming to put out should also help people who use financial services. And if you are wondering whether you're one of them, do you have a bank account? Do you have insurance? Do you have a company? And when I say a company, do you have even a mom and pop shop selling sweets in the Caribbean? These are some, do you use Western Union, MoneyGram, any money remitters? Do you work at a trust and corporate services provider, or do you work in any of these institutions? Do you work for an NPO, a nonprofit organization? Because they have AML CFT responsibilities as well. Are you a real estate agent? Are you a jeweler? Are you in high value goods? All of them have AML CFT requirements. And so on the face of it, yes, I've said financial services, but AML CFT covers a wide spectrum. And the last group that I would definitely want to implore to check this out, are you in fintech? Because I do speak fintech, not everything. I definitely am not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I would like to think that I've embraced the technology. I'm in a jurisdiction that does regulate virtual asset service providers, so I have that exposure, and I do believe that there is a need for more education and awareness for people in the fintech space who are disrupting financial services. Because while we welcome your disruption in terms of fast payments and better service and things that are just more user-friendly or create new opportunities for existing firms or even to financial inclusion, I think that understanding the role of regulation in a user-friendly manner, so let's have this interface, is important for fintech. So guys, for those that joined, thank you so much for joining the live. It's going to be up, it's going to be available. So I am going to try and announce the lives, post something on YouTube so that there's a schedule for persons to look out for the lives so that you can tell your friends and share and definitely engage. And I will see you on the next one. Don't forget to look in the description below. Make sure that you check out my blog. Again, the blog is not just for compliance professionals. It could be if you're compliance curious. And I look forward to engaging with you. The membership goes live on the 1st of December 2021. It is going to be a closed membership. So once the launch is closed, we will not be accepting any new members until the following launch, which will be at some future date. So guys, as I would say in my other YouTube videos, I'm going to end it here and I'll definitely catch you on the next one. And thank you again for those that joined.